Hello, welcome to our second set of videos. This one is on crisis in the cities. The syllabus description for this class is about 3 sentences long, and one of the sentences focuses directly on crisis in the cities and exploring that role in California. So this is kind of what the creators of the course had in mind as a major component. This first video is kind of the historical background for the whole crisis in the cities movement. This was a term that was developed in 1960 to 1975 in response to a conception that the cities were becoming like Gotham. The Post World War II, there's been quite a bit of white flight, and it bears taking a look at what the historical precedents were. So immigrants have long come to cities as their first destination. If you ever saw the movie An American Tale, Feifel first comes to New York City, and then in American Tale 2, he goes out west, and that's sort of the story of the American immigrant journey. Today, 22% of the residents of big cities are immigrants, whereas only 4% of the residents of rural areas are immigrants. And so immigrants have always been an important and vital part of cities. Um, After 1965, with a major overhaul in America's immigration laws, immigrants largely came from non-European countries. And so the makeup of the immigrants in the cities changed. The racial makeup of the immigrants in the cities changed. Okay, the second factor is after the Great Depression, there was what they call the Great Migration of Blacks from the South and into northern and western cities. The Great Depression had put a lot of financial pressure on Blacks in the South, and they moved to cities to look for better jobs. During this period, there were restrictive racial covenants that prohibited non-white people from certain areas, and which meant that you had a white side of the city and a black side of the city. And it was actually impossible for blacks to move into many of these white areas because of things that were in the deeds. When a house was sold, the deed said that you can only sell it to another white person. The covenants in response to the civil rights movement, these covenants got lifted, and so you had what was called blockbusting, and somebody buy a home in a white area. A white real estate investor would buy a home in a white area, sell it to a black person at a discount, and then that would cause all of the other white people on the block to quick sell their homes before the area fell to pieces. And I'm putting that in quotes. And then a traditionally white neighborhood would turn into a mixed neighborhood. And white people then would self-segregate, and they self-segregated largely in the suburbs. Finally, the post-World War II generation received GI benefits. We usually talk about these in terms of education benefits, but there were also real estate and home purchase benefits. Many of the people who were able to take advantage of this bought single family suburban homes, and this became the ideal. You wanted a quarter acre, you wanted room for a pool, you wanted room for an RV, and there were entire developments like Levittown in New York that were kind of aimed at these returning GIs who had the real estate GI benefits. And so all of this combined, these factors combined, led to a hollowing out of the cities, and white people moving to the suburbs, and as a result, um, um, you have a very different kind of city. Middle class families, especially middle class Caucasian families, moved to the suburbs, and the consumer facing businesses that served them followed them. And so we see that in the cities we have a hollowing out not just of residents but also of the stores and the restaurants and things like that that were there serving the white middle class customer. Um, we ended up with a situation where cities were composed of two groups. Wealthier residents, a lot of times they were members of what we call the creative class, people who worked in advertising and the arts and things like that. These wealthier residents remained in the city. Many of them were did not have children. As they had children, they moved to the suburbs. And then there were very poor residents, and um, the safety net and the social services had to suddenly provide for a greater percentage of the community needing these social services, and so that was and the tax base for providing those kind of services had been hollowed out as the businesses moved to the suburbs. The Many very poor residents, just in general, are members of historically disadvantaged populations, and so as a city becomes less white, it also tends to become more economically disadvantaged. The economic decay as the businesses left meant that tax receipts went down, and so there was less ability to support people who needed a lot of social services. And the economic decay led to higher rates of crime. And so this idea that we've hollowed out the consumer facing businesses, we have more crime, led to this general idea that the cities were a mess. As the cities declined, white flight increased, which led to greater the decline in the cities, and it became kind of a circular thing, and the circular spiral went downward. The suburbs during this period became more politically powerful, and as the suburban voters viewed the cities as cesspools, they were more likely to starve the city of resources. So they would vote in the suburban whites would vote in legislators who were verbally and in policy matters hostile to cities. Um, Whites tended to move out of a neighborhood just in general when they have children. You need different things. You need more bedrooms. You need parks that kids can play in. You need access to good schools, and so that having a child causes you to move in many situations. But whites are also likely to move when the demographics of the neighborhoods change. So right now, studies are showing that whites will move out of a neighborhood when the Asian American population exceeds 25% and or the Hispanic populations exceeds 21%. What this kind of means is that a move to the suburbs becomes a less reliable way for underrepresented groups to enter the middle class because the suburbs are kind of always shifting, and the house you buy doesn't represent the neighborhood you think you were buying into. And the other side of this is that privileged people are now starting to return to cities, and in doing so, they are pushing the historically underrepresented groups with strong ties to the neighborhood or the community. They're pushing them to the suburbs because the rents are rising so fast because of something called gentrification. Um, High crime and occasional riots have historically caused suburban voters to question whether cities are viable at all. So in the 1970s, there was a real question about whether New York City itself was going to make it. That they were all kinds of there's all kinds of talk about New York City actually collapsing in and of itself. The mayor of New York during the time went to Congress and asked for a bailout, and Congress said no, and it was just there were real problems, and so that's some of the background to what was happening at the time. Um, so the crisis in the cities really starts around 1960, but that is not the beginning of the kind of mob violence that we see in California. The Watts riots, which we'll explore in the next video, were kind of the launching pad for the crisis of the cities in California, but they weren't the first incident of mob violence. In the 19th century, there were several different incidents of anti-Chinese violence, including the Chinese massacre of 1871, the San Francisco riots of 1877, and the Pacific Coast race riots of 1907. And then during World War II, the Zoot Suit riots were when American servicemen attacked Mexican American immigrants living in Los Angeles. We talked about both of these things in our history section, so I'll just go over it briefly. The Zoot Suits were a popular form of Mexican American clothing at the time. The military personnel who were not from California saw them as unpatriotic because there had been fabric rationing. The LA then blamed the problem on Mexican Americans and white Southerners and said LA itself had no problem. And kind of the end result of all of this was that the city council passed a resolution criminalizing wearing zoot suits. But the law itself never passed. It was it was a resolution, but it never came into the force of law. So that's kind of the background for the kind of violence that we're going to see in the next video. So let's get on to that.